Multilateralism has been a significant feature of international relations in the 20th century, and it is also a dynamic historical process which cannot be dissociated from the context in which it has taken shape in recent times. It is both considered necessary and criticized for not being sufficient or significantly efficient, particularly in the face of increased geopolitical tensions between great powers. Is multilateralism the only solution to the challenges we face? Well, let's dig deeper today with our international relations expert, Paul Yombo. Thanks once more for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with this. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is talking about new policy briefs to help put the world back on track. I'll stress on the world back on track. And why do you think he and other world leaders are looking towards this direction of changing the world or putting it on a better place?
Well, what we can say is that there have been significant geopolitical events that have had a negative impact on the global cooperation and international peace. Chief of these events, we can, of course, cite the continuing turmoil in the Middle East, wars in Africa, and, of course, the Ukraine war that has marked the return of wars on the European territory.
Now, coupled with the insecurity that the world has been ravaging some parts of the world, like in the global south, in Africa. Then we had the COVID-19, and now we're talking about the Ukraine war that has made things worse on a range of counts. People are beginning to feel like the United Nations and other bodies of the post-Bretton Woods are not doing enough, or they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing to get the results that are needed to put these problems at bay.
Well, I think there are 3 points that can be that must be highlighted, underscored. The first point is to look at the situation of the world from a historical point of view. The 20th century was a century marked by multilateralism, but it was also a century marked by significant wars and conflict. First World War, Second World War, Cold War. These are 3 major conflicts that shaped geopolitical power relations and left an American world order. And the 2 arms of the American world order are the United Nations and NATO. And so the Pax Americana, as specialists call it, is characterized by a strong dominance of American military force, and the economic pendant is the presence of the West as an economic powerhouse of the world. In the last few years, in the last couple decades, the situation is turning around. In 30 years, the West, that is Europe, America, Australia, and Japan, went from 80% of the global GDP per year to now being 49% this year. So there's a shift in the economic power relations between the West and what some people call the non-West, to be general. And this economic shift has political and geopolitical consequences. And economic actors rationalize their economic domination in political domination. And that's what we're seeing now. Contestations of the liberal script, of the liberal world order, equally means contestation of the institutions that are put in place to assure American and Western domination. And this fight for hegemony is reaching its crux with not only the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but with the tensions between China and the United States of America for global leadership in peace areas. We know that China has brokered a peace deal in the Middle East. Global leadership in the economic field. There are technical skirmishes between American companies and Chinese companies.
And we'll see this, that we have some African nations were being criticized for welcoming a Russian collaboration or Russian collaboration. We saw when the crisis started, they were being criticized, and this will take me to back to the security meeting in Munich last year. That we had it was highlighted that Europe's problems are not the world's problems, that Europe should stop thinking that the world's problems or their problems are the world's problems and the world's problems are not theirs. I'm trying to say this because of the grievances that people have in Africa, that the way they have been reacting, their relations, China building a relationship now with Russia. You see Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting to broker deals and all of that. where does this put us, the grievances that it brings out to show, to highlight that really their problems are not ours. We also have our problems and the things we're looking for.
Yes, conceptually, scholars call that the provincialization of the West. And the provincialization of the West means that the West isn't the center of the world anymore. The West is just a province of the world, like other parts of the world are provinces of the world. As I described earlier, it's powered by economic dynamics, but it has geopolitical, civilizational, and cultural consequences. When you look at what emerging powers are doing to build other avenues of cooperation, a country like Turkey has opened more than 20 embassies in 10 years in Africa under Prime Minister Davutoglu. A country like Russia has started reopening its embassies from the year 2008. After almost 20 years of absence, or of almost quasi-absence, it has started giving scholarships to African students, and we see a flux of African immigrants going to other parts of the world, going to non-traditional partners. And so these new avenues of cooperation seem to be an issue for concern for the Western traditional powers that are losing influence, losing ground on the continent economically, but they're also losing influence geopolitically as African states become more economically resilient and independent from the West. The African countries of the 1960s and 70s aren't the African countries of the 2020s. The GDP of African countries has considerably risen, and they aren't as dependent on global development aid as they used to be. That means that Western powers have lost a major leverage on African states, and that can explain in part the kind of news coverage that we've been having these days and the admonishments that African leaders are receiving from the West. But it's in Africa's strategic interest to have its own bloc. Africa doesn't have to be on the left or on the right. Africa is the oldest continent in the world. We're going to be the most, we're the fastest growing continent on the world, second fastest growing continent on the world. We are going to have by 2050 about half of the world's useful population. So we're the continent of the future. I think it's legitimate for the continent of the future to have its own bloc and decide on which issues it cooperates with who.
But then we have the African Union. That was set up to handle some of these issues. So when you say this, I would like to know if you think the other things they're supposed to be doing differently, like a new strategy in order to have more power and more influence on some of these issues we face.
Well, the African Union has itself been significantly transformed in the last 20, 30 years, and it's still undergoing serious revisions and transformations. The change from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union was a major shift that marked its the recentering of the focus of the organization from the states to the people, from state security to human security, from state development to human development. And these shifts are continuing to be implemented with the African Free Trade Area, and more significantly with the Agenda 2063, which is a common vision for the continent that the African Union and African people want 100 years after the creation of the African Union in 1963. So the African Union has been instrumental with the regional economic communities that are impulsing regional integration, and regional integration as a lever for economic development. But the African Union needs to go further. Africa desperately needs more cooperation, more unity, more freedom of movement inside the continent, more trade amongst its states.
And since we're talking about integration in achieving goals and all of that, let's look at this. South Africa is going to be receiving Vladimir Putin come August this year, and there's been an arrest warrant. I would like to get your opinion on this, an arrest warrant on him. Do you think there's going to be a change in what happened in 2011 when Omar al-Bashir had same arrest warrant, but South Africa didn't arrest him?
Well, Africa has 10 years past with the International Court of Justice, and more generally the criminal international courts that are lodged in The Hague. African leaders have spearheaded an initiative to kill off the organization, and it was only through the intervention, the very strong intervention of certain Western states, that this initiative by African heads of state died down. So what we have had are assertions by a certain number of South African leaders, opposition leaders and ruling party leaders. Someone like Julius Malema very polemically said that he would accompany Vladimir Putin from the airport to his meeting places and back to the airport and assure himself that no one arrests him. So
and that really says a lot about our question earlier, or our statement earlier, saying that Europe's problems are not the world's problems.
Yes, the instrumentalization of international justice for geopolitical purposes is unacceptable. There's a strong sense in Africa and all around the world that the International Court of Justice is extremely biased. The International Court of Justice on a judicial standpoint doesn't have any legitimacy to investigate what's going on in Ukraine right now. Ukraine isn't a party to the Rome Statute. Not only Russia isn't a party, but Ukraine isn't a party. So that's the first major judicial issue. Second issue is that the Ukraine crisis wasn't handed to the Court of Justice by the Security Council as per the bylaws of the International Court of Justice, because Russia has a veto power in the Security Council and wouldn't accept its own leader to be under investigation by a UN organ. So the fact that the International Court of Justice would have such a double path policy, where with certain heads of states and with certain areas of the world they're very prompt to intervene and to denounce war crimes, and with other parts of the world they're much slower, is an issue of concern and is a part of the contestation of the existing multilateral order.
So any last words on how multilateralism can be used better, in a better way, to overcome the problems you're facing in the 21st century?
Well, in the 21st century, we're condemned to multilateralism. We have a historically unprecedented situation where the world's strongest power, which hasn't been the world's strongest power for very long, because before the Second World War, America was a medium-income economy. It was a medium power. It wasn't a world great power. So it hasn't been the world great power for very long. We can say with some certainty since the end of the Cold War, so it's been 30 years only. It's a relatively new order, actually, the Pax Americana. And so the contestation of the Pax Americana makes us ask ourselves, what are the other options we have to multilateralism? We might consider a world where there are different blocks, multipolar blocks, that are looking at each other at loggerheads, but it has economic consequences. Freedom of trade augments global prosperity. Freedom of movement augments cultural and human prosperity around the world. So we need to have a certain level of cooperation because of the level of technical integration of the world. We share a lot of non-physical infrastructure together, not only ideas, but apps and forums for discussion. So we need to maintain a level of global cooperation through multilateralism without stepping into hegemony from one bloc on the rest of the world.
Well, thanks again for your insights, Paul Yombo.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's the bottom line is multilateral institutions and the world leaders would have to identify targeted strategies to quell the crisis and move effectively to support the world's most vulnerable. Thanks for being with us today.